Hello, and once again, welcome to this webinar. I'm Gary from Consultants Like Us, a cybersecurity and information governance, risk and compliance consultancy. I'm going to chair this evening, as always, but I am joined by the co-founder of Consultants Like Us, Lee Scory. Say hi, Lee.
Welcome, everyone.
And the founder of iComply, Luke Keeley. Say hi, Luke. Are you there?
He's on mute.
I'm not. I'm here.
You're just messing with me. Okay, so but together we are iComply with Consultants Like Us, providing compliance without complexity. Now, we formed this partnership to help organizations understand security and data governance. And in this series, we're focusing very much on the FTC safeguards rule. If you haven't watched any of the other videos, I urge you to go and check them out so that you'll be able to catch up on some of the conversations that we're discussing, because we're going to go into detail around some of the requirements of the FTC safeguards rule. And this evening, we're going to continue our conversations that we've been having, because previously we discussed the need to build your WISP, your written information security program or plan, with administrative, technical and physical safeguards designed to protect customer information. So today, gents, I would like to discuss these additional requirements around the rule that talks about regularly monitoring and testing the effectiveness of your safeguards that you've implemented. Now, actually, there's two requirements here, isn't there? Monitor and test the effectiveness. Monitoring is not the same as testing. So I'd like, if we may, to start there. Remembering that we're talking about administrative, physical and technical safeguards. So I'd like to put that question to you. First of all, what do we mean by monitoring, and why is monitoring so important? So over to you. What do you think?
Rose before the thorn. Over to you.
Go for it, Luke.
Luke, would you like to go first?
Look, so this is actually a really big question. There are so many ways to answer it, but if we use the FTC safeguards rule, one of the first things it talks about is about risk. Now, risks is one of those things you have to manage and monitor on a regular basis. So when we talk about monitoring, it's, again, people would typically gravitate towards the technical controls, but monitoring is a very much an administrative thing as well, particularly around the risk side of things. Invariably, when you have some information security objectives, what are the things that are likely to stop you from achieving those? They're the kind of things that you might want to monitor on some sort of scheduled basis. It wouldn't necessarily have to be weekly or monthly. It would depend potentially on the nature of the objectives, whether they're strategic, operational, tactical, the risks that are likely to stop you from achieving those objectives. Some of them might be strategic again. They might be high, medium, and low. So at the very starting point, monitoring risks is one of those things that you need to do from the outset.
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah, it's you're absolutely right. As ever, when we're talking about safeguards rule and we're talking about controls, quite often our minds will gravitate towards the technical controls, or the tangible, the thing that we can lay our hands on. But that's a really good point, that risks need to be monitored, because risks can change. The geopolitical situations can change and can ebb and flow, as we all know. So those risks can change. We know that pandemics have happened, and certainly over many years before COVID outbreak, there were risks of outbreaks of avian flu and swine flu and such. So risks do change. So that's a really good point, that from an administrative perspective, that we should be thinking about the risks that we need to monitor. Lee, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on the risks here, because we have covered that in other areas, and I think we are going to spend more time going on it. But Luke, you're absolutely right. That starting point of just keeping on top of your risks, has the probability of that risk becoming more likely changed in any way, shape, or form? Has it become more probable or less probable? Is absolutely something you should be looking for, and a very, very good starting point.
So what other things should we be monitoring then? So I'm going to, just before I come to you on that one, Lee, just to keep on it, because you said something, Luke, which I think is very valid as well, is objectives. You should be monitoring your objectives. If the whole plan of implementing a good information security is in place, you should be checking quite regularly to see if you're on target, if you're on track. So the whole program needs to be monitored, right? But Lee, what other kind of things would you expect people to be monitoring in terms of those administrative controls or physical controls or technical controls?
I think from a technical standpoint, it would be looking at your technical systems. So looking at the logs coming through your systems to see if there's any strange logins from accounts. We've talked about the confidentiality and integrity of information previously. I think it's an interesting discussion point as well. I've lost count of the number of times I've looked at people's objectives, and one of them they put on is to ensure or to reduce the number of security incidents they've had. And I love this one because you often ask them, so how many incidents did you have last month or last year? And if the answer is none, it's like, it is. And we've used this term very strongly throughout this. Is it relevant? Have you defined objectives that are relevant to you? Because if you're not having incidents, what's the point of an objective to reduce the number of incidents? But other controls in place are, I'm going to breach over a little bit into the effectiveness of it, because this is going to come into the auditing of the controls that you put in place. Again, tie very strongly into your risk mitigation actions. Do you have sufficient mitigation in there to make sure that those risks do not become an incident or an issue?
Yeah, a very good point. And you're absolutely right about monitoring those objectives and the targets that people put in place. I've used this example a few times now. In the United Kingdom, we don't suffer too often from bushfires, but I've seen business continuity plans that talk about how to deal with a bushfire if it should break out. And I've also seen people talk about reducing incidents, as you said. And I've said, why don't you just put on there, reduction of number of bushfires? And they said, well, we don't have bushfires. And I said, but you don't know how many incidents you've had either. So why just put anything on there, and we're going to reduce the number of, raging hippos going through the streets. It's like, well, yeah, you've got to have something meaningful, haven't you? As something that you're monitoring, something that is meaningful to your organization. So for me, the kind of things I would be expecting people, thinking about the administrative side of it for a second, the kind of controls I would be expecting people to have would be monitoring compliance to policies and procedures, and that might be through adherence to those policies and procedures, through how many people have completed training, for instance, how many people, and it's not just security training, but checking competencies of individuals. So when you're looking to see how many people have completed that training, how have they completed it, is it effective or not, using that word that you used, Lee, I think very pointedly. They're the kind of administrative controls I would be expecting people to, or organizations to be looking to implement. Luke, in your experience, what other kinds of controls are people controls are people monitoring? Are there physical controls that you would expect people to be checking in on a fairly regular basis?
Yeah, I mean, depending on if you've got a physical office, absolutely. You can have the controls, like CCTV is a pretty obvious one if you have got it in place. Are you even reviewing the CCTV log on a regular basis to see that someone has actually attempted to get into your building. You never knew that if they did, but you're not going to know unless you actually check the CCTV, because those things aren't always abundantly clear. I think you'll have proximity cards, access logs, all those kind of physical securities controls would be available. I think just going back to the administrative thing, I think monitoring the compliance landscape, particularly the US at the moment, we have had a pretty sharp increase in the number of state data privacy laws. So monitoring what's going on in the data privacy landscape. If we take the FTC safeguards rule, just monitoring what's actually happening within the industry, because you had the first iteration of the FTC safeguards rule, I think was around about November 2023. Then there was another update June 2024 around about what the actual notification requirements are of how many people would have to be exposed before you'd actually have to report an incident. So just even keeping pace with legislation's quite important in its own right. One thing I just want to quickly ask the question for you, because you talked about earlier on around about security incidents. How much control have we realistically got over security incidents? So if we want to try and reduce, if a firm wants to try and reduce security incidents, why would you want to do such a thing? Yes, you want to see a reduction in it, but how much control have you got over it? If you've got threat actors that are going to send phishing campaigns at you, if you've got seasonal attack types through tax season, yes, you want to reduce them, but again, it's one of those not arbitrary, but one of those controls you haven't got much control of. So
no, I mean, we say it all the time, is if someone really wants to get your data, they will get it.
Yeah,
they will get
absolutely.
it. It's just how quickly they can get to it. So for me, it's just making sure, when you're looking at the sort of risks that you do have in your organization, do you have sufficient controls in to at least highlight you to incidents that are taking place, to erroneous actors getting into your systems, even just looking at your threat intelligence, what's going on in the marketplace that may or may not affect you. Looking back over some of the clients I've worked with, companies that are small in themselves but work with a major corporation, and when they announce that a deal has been brokered where they're working together, that small company becomes a huge attack vector. And I've literally watched firewalls go white hot. So being mindful again of what sort of messages are you communicating out that may need to be monitored even further.
It could be something. Sorry, Gary, go for it.
No, go for it, Luke. Go for it.
It could be just something as simply as passive, something that everybody's got to do. In that, who's actually around me, monitoring. Do I even know that person who's sat next to me? Do I even know that person who's making the delivery at the front desk? That person who's actually checking the smoke alarm or the fire alarm or the burglar alarm. Are they actually a legitimate employee? It's just one of those things that everyone thinks, oh, we've got security, we've got controls for that, but invariably everybody's got a pair of eyes, or if not, they've got some sort of sense where they might be able to hear or see, possibly even smell something that's not quite right.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's a similar thing I was about to say actually, is all these monitors that we're talking about putting in place here is who is doing the monitoring. Is it almost like the Wizard of Oz sat behind this green velvet curtain, who's pulling levers and is monitoring and all seeing and all knowing, or actually a little bit more realistic is, as you just described, Luke, it's people monitoring their own environments. Certainly when I've worked with organizations who had real issues around the threat of bombs, for instance, one of the things that we used to say to people, and it was quite a surprise to some people, is when they would say, well, we would evacuate the building and let the police come in and such like. Our response to that would be, but in actual fact, the best people to check their environment to see if there's something unusual is the people who work there, not to interfere with anything, but if I've worked in a call center or if I worked in an office, I'm monitoring my area, and if suddenly I see a box that's in the corner that I've never seen before, and there's been a bomb threat or a bag or something like that, then I'm going to be much better placed to be able to say that looks out of place, rather than the emergency services who are going to come in and look around and see everything as an unusual potential threat. So the people who are monitoring, I think you're absolutely right. From a physical perspective, it's not just one individual or one IT team looking at a pane of glass and saying, right, we've got everything covered. So in terms of monitoring, there are multiple things, aren't there? There's different levels, doesn't have to be overly complicated, but I think to summarize what we've just said there, starting with you, Luke, in terms of understanding, monitoring risks, understanding that the changing landscape, and that it can include, of course, the geopolitical, the compliance shifting sands of what's going on out there. But then to what you said, Lee, which is around the effectiveness. So whatever monitoring you are going to do, you have to make sure it is appropriate and it's effective to you as an organization. And there's very many different levels, isn't there?
Mm.
Okay. So there's lots of possibilities, lots of things that people can monitor, but starting at that level, I think. And again, as ever, we're trying to give people something practical that they can latch onto, to take away and think about. So think about those risks and objectives and who's doing the monitoring. But that's only one part of this equation. The other part of it is testing. So what do we mean, or what do we think FTC Safeguards Rule is asking us to think about when it's talking about testing? What does testing actually mean, and what does it look like?
That's an interesting one, because I think I find written. I'm going to jump straight into the testing. It does talk about vulnerability scanning, and it does talk about penetration testing in the FTC Safeguards Rule. Now, like with most vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, I don't think you can be overly prescriptive as to how often it needs to happen, because it depends on the size and the complexity of the organization to which it's being applied. But if you're not doing vulnerability scanning, it does talk about doing penetration testing on a recurring basis.
Before you move on, Luke, just very quickly, just for anyone who's not aware, what would, in a very simple way, what would you say is the difference between a vulnerability test and a penetration test, a pen test?
Yeah, it's actually a really valid point. Yeah, I apologize, because you just automatically get into the world where you assume that everybody that you're talking to understands what those things are, or even what the difference between them are. So vulnerability scanning in its most general sense is effectively a passive test, and it looks at typically laptops, what you call as endpoints, or your infrastructure, and it looks for when I say vulnerability, potential weaknesses on a particular device that could be exploited either internally or externally by a cyber criminal in general sense. So when it passively looks at it, it'll find it, it'll alert you to it, and then it'll generally give you an idea about what you need to do to fix it, whether it be a patch or a workaround or an update, whatever that may well be. Penetration testing takes that to another level, where it's a more offensive in nature, where it actually goes one layer further to saying, can I actually break through your control? So let's talk about passwords. Passwords are an easy one. They can actually test to see how many characters you're using in your password, what kind of complexity, have you got your uppercase and lowercase? It could be even testing any software vulnerabilities on a piece of on a hardware. It could be an application. So really it is about actually trying to break through your controls. That's probably a really bad definition and explanation about what
I think that's an excellent description of that. The analogy I always give when talking about the difference between a vulnerability test and a pen test is, imagine you're standing outside the front of a house and you're a wannabe burglar, and as a vulnerability test, you're just going to stand there and look at the house. You can see that there's a fence around the house. You can see there's a gate. You can see the door is locked. There's a window that looks like it's not locked. It's maybe slightly ajar. It's the house is in darkness. There's a sign that says "Beware of the dog," and you can see there are some weaknesses and some vulnerabilities. The wall's not that high, so you could easily climb over it. The door looks like if you gave it a hefty kick, you could get through it. And that's a vulnerability scan. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just looking to see if it's possible. Whereas a penetration test is, I'm going to scale that wall. I'm going to jangle the gate, see if a dog comes out. I'm going to go and just open the window. And if I can climb through the window, does it take me into a locked room, or does it give me access to the entire building? So that's a penetration test. That for me is the real world analogy of the difference between a pen test and a vulnerability scan. If that's not overly simplifying it, but that's how I differentiate the two when I'm trying to explain it to people. So
no, it makes sense. I mean, analogies are the way forward. We talked about brakes the other week. So brakes on a car and the reality of that
this is true.
into an information security program.
So sorry to get you off target on that one, but penetration tests and vulnerability scanning is mentioned within the FTC safeguards rule. So yeah, we'll carry on from there. What does it expect, do you think?
I think the output is probably less. I think the fact you're actually doing some level of testing. The output isn't defined. They don't tell you the kind of things that you should expect to see. I think it's more the fact that you're actually doing some level of technical testing to make sure that you are providing the appropriate security controls to protect customer data, first and foremost. What that looks like, again, is really dependent on the size of the firm, the complexity, whether it's on-premise or cloud-based infrastructure. So again, it's a bit of a moving target. It really depends on your firm. But I would say that level of either, whether you're doing vulnerability scanning yourself or you've got a third party doing it for you, that is invariably going to be the way that you're going to find out where you've got deficiencies in your infrastructure, in your security controls in some way, shape or form, invariably. On the other side to that is the testing is around your auditing, about have you got an information security practitioner actually managing looking at the effectiveness of your information security program? You know, when were your policies last updated? That's effectively a test to make sure, have they been updated on a regular basis? Are they fit for purpose? Do they say what they expect of the business and the employees? Do they link to a particular security control? So if you're talking about password policy, does the password policy outline what the expectations are about how people manage their passwords or what the length and complexity should be? So you've got auditing, but invariably will also link to a technical aspect as well.
Okay. Lee, what's your thoughts around this, the kind of test that you've experienced and that you would advocate for people to take on?
Yeah, I mean, typically, especially for small organizations, and this is going to be a bit of a tricky one, because what we would do technically is look to make sure that controls we have in place. So segregation of duty, classic one. Can an individual with a user account with this level of access only see what they should be seeing? So testing that level of access is happening. The challenge there for those smaller organizations is, more often than not, and I'm sorry to say it, they're set up as local administrators or domain administrators because it's just easier, or no one's thought it through because they're not that way inclined, and therefore your test is irrelevant because everyone's going to see everything. So to me, that's a big challenge for any organization.
Yeah, I would agree. And who do we think is doing these tests? Is this back to the qualified individual that we've been talking about previously?
Not necessarily, especially when it comes to those technical tests. The best person to do them often, in my mind, is the technical teams, the IT teams. But there's an element of how far can they go, because on the flip side of that is the technical teams will know how to install software, will know how to get it to a point where it's waiting for you to log on. At that point, your IT team kind of folds its arms, steps back and says, my job here is done. Your software is there for you to use. It's now over to the end users to make sure the software is doing what they say it should be doing. So there's a big push on not just leaving it up to IT to do these tests. For me, joint effort between the IT teams and the business teams to make sure that everything that you say is happening is actually happening.
Mm. I think that's a really good
I don't
point.
think the
Sorry,
qualified individual can really not be involved. You know, whether they've actually got it internal or external. That qualified individual is going to define the scope, potentially the frequency of the testing. So whether they're actually responsible or not, they're going to be accountable for it to making sure that it's at least happening.
I think you're right. I think the word that pops to my mind around all of this as I'm listening to you both talk and as I'm thinking about the kind of tests I would expect is the qualified individual's got to coordinate it. I think that's the key thing. I think, and whilst there are many plates to be spinning here, if you can keeping on the theme of administrative, physical, and technical controls, it's what are the kind of tests I could do from an administrative side of things, which we've touched upon a few times there about the audits of policies and procedures and such, and through to the physical, so those security guards, alarms. So jump into my mind, on the physical side of things, I'm thinking the obvious test, fire drills. When was the last time we did a fire drill? When did we last test to make sure everyone knows where the evacuation points are? When was the last time that we did any smoke alarms or maybe heat or underfloor water detection systems? Those kinds of things. Are we testing them on a regular basis? What about generators? Do you have a generator on site? Do you have UPS, the uninterruptible power supply, the big battery that keeps things going over when power may have failed? When was the last time that was tested? So speaking to your head of facilities, for instance, would be the kind of person you would speak to. And then, dare I say it, the easy, and I'm putting it in air quotes because it's not easy, clearly, but the obvious ones, which is the vulnerability tests, this technical pen tests. You might even do a physical pen test, right? You might even, depending upon the size of your organization, maybe you see what happens if you can someone just trick their way into your offices, into your physical location.
So you've talked about tricking your way in. So we haven't really talked about testing our people, which fits nicely into the security education training and awareness program that you have in some way, shape, or form. Phishing tests are an obvious one that you see a lot of firms, a lot of organizations tend to run simulated phishing campaigns to see if they can catch you out. It's probably the strong word. I think some businesses probably do try and catch you out. I'm not a huge fan of phishing exercises for a variety of different reasons. I think they do have a place if they're done right. But I guess again, the testing, not necessarily can they either identify it, but what do they do when they get it? Do they respond? Which I think is probably about the same, if not more important, is the response aspect of phishing.
Luke, you've neatly almost taken us on to next time, which is where we're going to talk about that very topic. But for now, we'll revert back to this. But you are absolutely right. It's that testing of people, and when we talk about tests of people, whilst it's not always just the people at the sharp end, shall we say, making sure that the receptionist knows to get people to sign in, and do they actually get people to sign in, or do they allow people just to tailgate, those kinds of things. Of course, for me, one of the biggest tests that needs to happen, we talk about disaster recovery tests quite regularly. So can you recover your systems when within the time frame that you've set? So what's your recovery time objective? How quickly do you want your systems to be back up and running? But so that's a test. That's a big and usually a very technical test. But it's testing of your incident response team as well, bringing them together, do they know where to find their plan? Do they know what the content of their plan is? Do they know how to invoke any contingency processes that may need to invoke? That testing of people, I think it's important to say that it's through every level of the organization, but none more important, I think personally, at the senior level of how would you respond to a major incident. You don't want the first time your incident response team to come together when you've had a bad thing. You want them to come together more regularly. What's your thoughts around that, Luke? I'm going to come to you and then Lee, but Luke, I know you've been involved in a number of these kinds of things because of your law enforcement background as well. So what's your thoughts around incident response teams and testing and such?
There's two parts to that. One, practice makes perfect. I can say, look, even from a firearms standpoint, you do not want to be simulating going through a rapid entry without having tested about who's going to put the door through, who's going to go in first, who's going to carry the shield, how do you protect, above from threats from above and behind, and, actually having an idea about what you do inside the room. So that practice is absolutely crucial. So yeah, I will always say it. But the other thing is keeping it so ridiculously simple. We could probably be, I know they keep it the KISS side of thing, but I think keep it ridiculously simple. I just don't think overcomplicating it just creates more problems than you need. And I think actually testing the complexity of your plan is actually quite important as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, practice makes perfect. You're absolutely right. Lee, what's your thoughts around disaster recovery tests? And I know you've got a lot of experience in that area as well. So DR testing and incident response tests and such. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, again, the DR test in the business continuity, it's very easy to overlook this in the modern world because we're heavily cloud-based, using infrastructure that's got multiple redundancies in place, extra power lines coming in, extra network links coming in, multiple hard drives. The likelihood of, we've often said it, the likelihood of these major data centers, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, going down is so small, so insignificant that it's almost not worth testing.
Having said, to fail, those words, too big to fail, are echoing around my head somewhere.
Exactly. And this has happened here in the UK. I'm sorry, Google's data centers overheated. Yes, we did have one hot summer. Their data centers couldn't handle it, and they failed. They shut down. Microsoft had quite often had authentication issues, so you can't even get into you can't even authenticate yourself against your systems. I think the testing point, all of us have talked about it here, it's the human element. Go and test the human element of your business continuity. If you're sat there and you're asking questions about how the business operates, and they're saying, well, Gary does this, and well, who does that? Well, Gary does that, and who does this? Well, Gary does that. Great. Guess what the next test is going to be? I'm going to take Gary out of the business. I'm going to lock him up in a corner somewhere, and you cannot rely on him now. How is your business going to progress? What do you need?
I think that's a great idea, and I think that's actually, you both come to a natural place, which is really interesting, because we're going to draw this conversation to a close here, because we've all got to a point, I think, where we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about next time. There's a lot to take away around this in terms of the monitoring and testing aspects. Remembering, everyone who's watching this, that you need to think about the administrative, the physical, and the technical aspects of both monitoring and testing. So again, two elements across three different domains you need to be thinking about. But Luke, Lee, myself, we've all kind of, whilst we've talked about these things, we've all gravitated towards one final conclusion, which is it's still all about your people, which is quite nice, really, because in our next discussion, we're going to continue our journey through the FTC safeguard rule, and we're going to talk about the next requirement. And we're going to go into a lot more detail about people, and how you train your staff, how you train people. Luke touched on an important and an interesting view here, which is around phishing and phishing tests and such. So we'll explore that in a lot more detail. But how do we ingrain security within our organization? And dare I say it, preempting something we'll say next time, we'll talk about the ever elusive security culture, which many organizations and many individuals are chasing, that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But next time, we're going to talk about training your staff. So with that, thanks, Luke. Thanks, Lee, for joining us again. Hopefully you found that interesting. I know I certainly did. Always learned something new and interesting. So thanks everyone for joining us. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment and share, because you never know who you might be helping. You'll certainly be helping us. But until next time, stay safe, stay well and stay connected. All the very best. Bye.
Yes.